On the morning of April 25, 1945, the streets of Prague did not look like the end of a war. They looked like the beginning of one. Barricades rose in front of tram lines, windows filled with rifle barrels. Czech radio transmitters crackled with coded messages telling civilians to fight. For 6 years, the city had lived under German control. But that morning, it chose something far more dangerous than survival. It chose to gamble on who would own it when the guns finally stopped. Prague was not rising up because Germany was still strong. It was rising up because Germany was finished. Hitler was dead. Berlin was surrounded. German units across Europe were surrendering by the tens of thousands. But Prague remained under the control of tens of thousands of German troops who still occupied its streets, guarded its bridges, and operated its Gestapo prisons. If the war ended with those forces still in place, the city would not be liberated. It would simply be handed over. The Czech resistance understood that difference. They also understood something else. The army that liberated Prague would determine its future. American troops meant one outcome. Soviet troops meant another. And in late April 1945, those two armies were racing toward the same prize from opposite directions. Less than 100 miles to the west, George S. Patton's Third Army was tearing through Bavaria and western Czechoslovakia. His armored columns were moving so fast that German defenses often collapsed before American reconnaissance units could even map them. Towns surrendered without a fight. Prisoners were taken by the thousands. The war in Patton's sector no longer felt like combat. It felt like pursuit. For the people of Prague, Patton was not just a general. He was a deadline. If his tanks reached the city first, Prague would be liberated by the West. Czechoslovakia would fall inside the American sphere. If the Red Army arrived first, the Soviets would take control, and no amount of celebration would change what that meant. So the Czech resistance did something extraordinary. They did not wait for the Allies to arrive. They started the war themselves. Radio Prague broadcast open calls for rebellion. Civilians poured into the streets. Barricades were thrown up across major intersections. German patrols were ambushed. Police stations were seized. Within hours, Prague was in open revolt, not against a strong occupier, but against a collapsing one. The goal was not to defeat Germany. The goal was to remove Germany before someone else replaced it. German commanders inside the city knew exactly what was happening. They also knew something the Czech fighters could not see from their barricades. The Red Army was closing in from the east. Soviet forces had already smashed through the last organized German defenses in Moravia. They were advancing fast, and they were advancing with purpose. Prague was not just another city. It was a capital, an industrial hub, and a political trophy. For the German garrison, this created a brutal choice. Surrender to the Soviets meant captivity that often ended in death. Surrender to the Americans meant prisoner of war camps, food, and eventually survival. So German officers began looking for a way out of the city that did not go east. They found it in the Czech resistance. Quiet negotiations began. German units offered to withdraw from Prague if they were allowed to march west and surrender to Patton instead of Stalin. The Czech fighters agreed. It was not an act of mercy. It was a calculation. Every German soldier who left Prague was one less man defending the city when the Soviets arrived. Every column that marched west increased the chance that Prague would be empty of occupiers when Patton's tanks rolled in. Corridors were opened. German convoys began slipping out of the city, moving through streets that had been battlegrounds only hours before. Czech fighters watched them go, knowing that those same men had enforced 6 years of occupation. But the future mattered more than revenge. What counted was who would take their place. The gamble was brutal in its simplicity. If the Americans arrived in time, Prague would belong to the West. If they did not, lower the deal would only have delayed the inevitable. And somewhere far beyond the city's burning skyline, 2 armies were still racing toward a destination neither of them had been invited to share. In the last week of April 1945, Patton's forward headquarters sat in a small town west of the Czech border, its walls covered with maps that were already out of date. The colored pins marking German positions had become almost meaningless. Enemy units were dissolving faster than they could be recorded. What still mattered were the arrows, and every one of them pointed east. Patton's Third Army was no longer fighting a traditional campaign. It was rolling through the wreckage of a defeated enemy. Roads that had been prepared for fierce defense were now clogged with German soldiers trying to surrender. Entire towns raised white flags before American columns even reached them. To Patton, this was not a signal to slow down. It was proof that speed mattered more than anything else. Prague appeared on his maps like a prize just beyond reach. It was not just another city. It was a capital, an industrial center, and a political symbol. If American forces took it, the balance of power in Central Europe would tilt westward before any conference could undo it. Patton understood this instinctively. He had seen how armies shaped borders simply by arriving first. His staff could see it too. Intelligence reports were already filtering in about unrest inside Prague. Radio intercepts mentioned barricades and fighting. Czech sources spoke openly about an uprising. This was not a rumor. It was a city trying to free itself before the war ended. Patton wanted to go. He had pushed his troops hard for months, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. But this was exactly the kind of moment he believed wars were won. Not through negotiation, not through careful diplomacy, but through relentless forward motion. Every mile his tanks advanced denied the enemy space to maneuver, and denied politicians the chance to rewrite reality later. But Patton did not command in a vacuum. Orders still flowed down from Eisenhower's headquarters, and those orders were no longer about destroying German armies. They were about managing what came after Germany collapsed. That meant lines on maps, agreements with allies, and a kind of caution Patton had never trusted. From his position west of Prague, Patton could feel the contradiction growing. He was closer to the city than any other Allied force. His troops were fresh, supplied, and ready to move. And inside Prague, People were fighting and dying under the assumption that American tanks were on the way. Every hour that passed without an order to advance made that assumption more dangerous. Patton was close enough to change history. Whether he would be allowed to was no longer up to him. While Patton's columns idled on roads that led straight toward Prague, the city's fate was being decided in rooms far removed from gunfire. At Supreme Allied Headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower stood over maps that showed not just where armies were, but where they were allowed to go. By late April 1945, the war against Germany was essentially won. What remained was the far more delicate problem of how that victory would be divided. The Allied leadership was no longer focused on breaking German resistance. They were focused on preventing a new war from starting the moment the old one ended. The Soviet Union had lost millions of soldiers fighting Hitler. Its armies now occupied vast stretches of Eastern Europe. Stalin expected those sacrifices to be rewarded with influence, territory, and security. Eisenhower understood that pushing too far east could turn a fragile alliance into open confrontation. So a line had been drawn. It ran roughly from northern Germany down through Czechoslovakia, marking where American and Soviet forces were supposed to meet. West of that line, U.S. and British armies would operate. East of it, the Red Army would take over. The goal was to avoid accidents, misunderstandings, and the kind of armed encounters that could spiral out of control. On that map, Prague was not American. To Eisenhower, this was a matter of coalition management. To Patton, it was a cage. He had built his entire reputation on speed, on seizing opportunities before they disappeared. Now, the greatest opportunity in Central Europe sat just beyond a political boundary that did not exist on the ground. Reports of the Prague Uprising reached Allied headquarters quickly. Eisenhower knew civilians were fighting German forces inside the city. He also knew Patton was close enough to intervene. But moving American troops into Prague would mean crossing the agreed line, openly challenging Soviet claims before the war was even officially over. The line was supposed to prevent conflict. It was about to create one in everything but name. Eisenhower chose to hold it. The order that went out to Patton's headquarters was simple and devastating. The Third Army was not to advance into Prague. It was to stop at the demarcation line and wait for the Soviets to take the city. On paper, it was a diplomatic decision. On the streets of Prague, it meant something else entirely. Inside Prague, the uprising had already turned the city into a maze of smoke, rubble, and improvised defenses. Czech fighters held intersections with rifles and captured machine guns. Trams lay overturned across streets, forming barricades that cut German patrols off from one another. For civilians, the air was thick with both hope and fear. They believed they were fighting for their freedom. They did not yet realize they were also fighting against a clock. German commanders did realize it. They could hear the distant rumble of artillery from the east. Soviet units were closing in. The Red Army was not slowing down for negotiations or local arrangements. It was advancing as a conquering force, and everyone in Prague knew what that meant for Germans who were still in uniform when it arrived. The garrison faced two enemies. The Czech resistance was attacking from within. The Soviets were approaching from without. Staying in the city meant being crushed between them. But there was a way out, if it could be arranged quickly enough. German officers reached out to Czech intermediaries. They proposed a bargain that was as cynical as it was logical. If the resistance allowed German units to withdraw westward through their barricades, the Germans would abandon their positions and leave Prague in Czech hands. In return, they would be able to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. The Czech leadership accepted. It was not an act of mercy. It was a calculation. Every German soldier who left Prague was one less man defending the city when the Soviets arrived. Every column that marched west increased the chance that Prague would be empty of occupiers when Patton's tanks rolled in. Corridors were opened. German convoys began slipping out of the city, moving through streets that had been battlegrounds only hours before. Czech fighters watched them go, knowing that those same men had enforced 6 years of occupation. But the future mattered more than revenge. What counted was who would take their place. The gamble was brutal in its simplicity. If the Americans arrived in time, Prague would belong to the West. If they did not, the deal would only have delayed the inevitable. And somewhere far beyond the city's burning skyline, 2 armies were still racing toward a destination neither of them had been invited to share. Patton received the order in a command post that was already preparing to move again. His staff had been mapping routes toward Prague, calculating fuel requirements, and estimating how long it would take armored columns to reach the city. The momentum of the campaign made the advance feel inevitable. Then the message arrived that changed everything. The Third Army was not to go any farther east. The demarcation line was now operational. Patton was to halt his forces and wait. Prague, despite being in revolt and within striking distance, was designated a Soviet objective. To Patton, the order was infuriating. He could see what was happening on the ground. German resistance was collapsing. Czech civilians were risking their lives to throw off occupation. And the American army that could reach them fastest was being told to stand down in the name of an agreement made far away from the fighting. He challenged the decision. Messages went back up the chain of command. Patton argued that the situation in Prague was not theoretical. It was real. People were dying. And the United States had the power to intervene immediately. The answer did not change. For Eisenhower, the line was not about Prague alone. It was about the entire post-war order. Breaking it, even for a city in open revolt, would signal to Stalin that American promises meant nothing. That risk, in his view, was greater than the fate of any single capital. So Patton's tanks stayed where they were. American units that could have driven into Prague in a matter of hours instead dug in and waited. They listened to reports of fighting inside the city. They watched German prisoners stream westward into their custody. And they did nothing. For the Czech resistance, this delay was invisible. They still believed the Americans were coming. For the Soviets, it was an open invitation. East of Prague, the Red Army was advancing through territory that had already been shattered by years of war. Villages lay in ruins. German units were either retreating in disarray or surrendering outright. But Soviet commanders were not interested in slowing down to clean up the battlefield. Their objective was ahead of them, and it was political as much as it was military. Prague was one of the last major prizes left in Central Europe. It was a capital city, a cultural center, and a symbol of authority over Czechoslovakia. Whoever took it would not just end the war there. They would write the first chapter of what came next. Stalin's generals understood that time mattered. The Americans were close. They might be restrained by their own leadership, but no one could be sure how long that restraint would hold. So Soviet units were ordered forward with urgency. Bridges were seized, roads were cleared, tanks and infantry pushed through exhausted German defenses that barely existed anymore. As the Red Army closed in, intelligence reports confirmed what Soviet commanders already suspected. Prague was in revolt. German forces were withdrawing. The city was destabilized and vulnerable. That made it even more important to arrive first. Inside Soviet headquarters, there was no debate about whether Prague belonged to them. The line on Eisenhower's map was taken seriously. The Western Allies had agreed to it. Now it was time to enforce it. Soviet artillery could already be heard by Czech fighters holding barricades in the city. What they heard as distant thunder was in reality the sound of a new occupation approaching. Prague had tried to choose its future. The Red Army was about to choose it for them. West of Prague, near the city of Pilsen, American troops waited on roads that led straight into history. Tanks idled in fields. Infantry units camped beside highways that pointed directly toward the uprising they could not reach. For soldiers who had spent months advancing through Germany at relentless speed, the stillness felt unnatural. Patton remained at his headquarters, reading and rereading reports from Prague. Fighting continued inside the city. Civilians were dying. German units were withdrawing through the very corridors the Czech resistance had opened for them. Every update made the situation more urgent, and every hour of waiting made the American absence more visible. The Third Army was close enough that some units could have reached Prague in less than a day. Fuel was available. Roads were open. There was no German force left that could stop them. The only barrier was the order not to go. Patton knew what that meant. By the time the Americans were allowed to move, if they ever were, someone else would already be there. Liberation was not just a military act. It was a political one. And the army that arrived first would shape everything that followed. Messages from Eisenhower's headquarters did not change. The line held, the orders stood. So the American soldiers stayed where they were, listening to distant artillery and watching German prisoners march west into their custody. They were winning the war and losing the peace at the same time. Prague was still fighting. The Red Army was still coming. And the only force that could have changed that balance was being told to wait. By May 7, 1945, Prague was exhausted. The uprising that had begun with radio calls and homemade barricades was now a grinding struggle to hold streets that no longer had any real defenders. German forces were still withdrawing westward, slipping through the corridors the Czechs had opened, leaving behind pockets of chaos and destruction. Every column that left made the city weaker, even as it brought the dream of American liberation closer in theory. Czech fighters could hear the war moving toward them. The thunder of artillery was no longer distant. Soviet guns were approaching from the east, pounding what remained of German positions outside the city. The sound echoed through neighborhoods already scarred by days of fighting. Civilians crowded cellars and stairwells, waiting for an outcome they could not influence. They had risked everything to avoid one occupation, and now they were watching another one draw closer. Radio broadcasts still spoke of holding on, still spoke of the Americans. But in the streets, reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The clock was running out, and the army they wanted was not coming. Prague had made its choice. Now it was about to live with someone else's. On May 9, 1945, Soviet tanks rolled into Prague. They came through streets that were still marked by barricades, burned vehicles, and the wreckage of an uprising that had already spent itself. Czech fighters lowered their weapons, not because they had won, but because the war was over. German forces that remained were disarmed and taken away. The flags changed, the gunfire faded. To the outside world, it looked like liberation. To many in Prague, it felt like something else. The Red Army had not been invited by the resistance. It had not coordinated with the uprising. It had arrived because it had the power to arrive. Soviet soldiers took control of government buildings, radio stations, and key intersections. The city passed from one foreign army to another in a matter of hours. The German troops who had fled west were already in American hands. They would survive the war in prisoner-of-war camps. Those who were captured by the Soviets faced a very different fate. For them, surrender meant disappearance into a system few ever returned from. Prague was no longer a battlefield. It was a prize. News of the Soviet entry into Prague reached American headquarters within hours. Patton read the reports in silence. The city he had been close enough to take, the city whose people had risen up believing he was coming, was now firmly in someone else's hands. There was no longer anything to argue about. The line on the map had become reality. Among Allied commanders, the mood was not celebratory. They had won the war, but they had also just watched a major European capital slip beyond their reach without a shot being fired by American forces. Diplomacy had held. Politics had prevailed. And the cost of that restraint was now visible in the streets of Prague. Patton understood what it meant. He had spent his career watching how armies created facts on the ground that no negotiation could undo. Now he was watching the opposite happen. A city had been lost not to enemy strength, but to Allied caution. The war in Europe was over. The struggle over its future had just begun. When the shooting stopped in Prague, the city did not return to itself. It passed quietly from one form of control to another, and the difference between them would define an entire generation. Soviet soldiers remained in the streets. Communist officials moved into government buildings. New flags replaced old ones. What had begun as a spontaneous uprising to reclaim Czech independence beat ended as the opening chapter of a new political reality. For the people who had built barricades and fought German patrols only days earlier, the change was disorienting. They had risked everything, believing that American tanks would arrive. They had imagined a future aligned with the West, rebuilt with help from countries that spoke openly about democracy and self-determination. Instead, they found themselves under the authority of an army that answered to Moscow. At first, the shift was subtle. The Soviets were still allies on paper. They had fought and bled against Hitler. But their presence was not temporary. Political advisors arrived alongside military units. Local communist leaders were elevated. Non-communist parties were tolerated only so long as they did not challenge the new order. Within 3 years, Czechoslovakia would be fully absorbed into the Soviet sphere. In 1948, a communist coup ended what remained of independent Czech politics. Prague, which had tried to choose its future in the final days of the war, would spend the next 4 decades inside a system it had never voted for. The decision that made this possible had not been made in Prague. It had been made at Allied headquarters, on a map, with a pencil. The demarcation line that Eisenhower refused to cross was meant to preserve the alliance with the Soviet Union. In doing so, it handed one of Central Europe's most important capitals to Stalin without a fight. Patton never forgot it. He had seen how close the Third Army came. He had seen how easily Prague could have been taken. And he had watched as a political boundary erased that possibility. To him, it was proof that wars were not just won on battlefields. They were lost in conference rooms. Eisenhower believed he had done what was necessary. He had kept the Allied coalition intact long enough to finish off Hitler. He had avoided a potential clash with the Red Army that could have spiraled into something far worse. In his view, restraint was the price of peace. Prague was the price of that restraint. The city's uprising did not fail because its fighters lacked courage. It failed because they were trapped between 2 forces that cared more about where a line was drawn than about who had drawn it. The Germans exploited that gap to save themselves. The Soviets rushed to fill it. And the Americans, bound by their own agreements, stood aside. When historians later looked back at the start of the Cold War, they often pointed to speeches, treaties, and ideological conflicts. But for the people of Prague, it began in those final days of World War II, when the city reached out for one army and another answered. The streets where Czech civilians had died believing help was on the way became streets patrolled by foreign soldiers for decades. The factories that might have been rebuilt with Western aid were folded into the Soviet system. The political life of the nation was reshaped by an occupation that had never been asked for. All of it traced back to that moment when Prague tried to surrender and was told, without ever being informed, that its choice did not matter. The war had ended, but the cost of that ending had only just begun.